Well, hello, everyone. This is Aaron Philbeck here at Chi Association. I'm excited to have a conversation with Mads Gosvig and John Greaves of Railpen, who have helped us along this journey of trying to explore what TPA looks like in practice and the journey that's required to go from the old traditional SAA to TPA. So Railpen was a contributor on our follow-up piece from vision to execution, and were instrumental in helping us think through what this looks like in practice. So Mads, John, thanks so much for joining me for this conversation.
Happy to be here.
Pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, I want to start with just maybe the why behind TPA and the rationale for why anyone would want to go on this journey. And Mads, maybe if I can start with you. Railpen has a lot of underlying pension schemes, so there's complexity that comes with that. And so there might be this natural inclination of let's just make this as simple as possible and kind of follow a more standardized process. But you all have adopted that more holistic kind of TPA-like thinking. Could you just walk us through that thought process of why you feel TPA is an appropriate model to be pursuing for an organization like Railpen?
Yes, absolutely. So the ultimate goal is to deliver better on the scheme objectives. That's the whole idea of doing things in a different way. We came back 10 years ago, perhaps, from a different world where we had a more classic approach to asset management, and we have now moved into a sort of a more a TPA approach. A TPA approach is not just one thing that you apply and then it's different to something else. It is actually a sort of a series of things that you can do, and you can do it to a bigger and lesser degree. And that's sort of the what will come out of your process. So what are we trying to achieve is that essentially that we want our investment decisions to be sort of related directly to the portfolio objective. For us, it's the portfolio objectives are based to deliver the returns that are needed to support the defined benefit pensions that we pay out. And that's the goal in our scheme. And you say, yeah, yes, we have complexity. So we have many sub schemes in there where sort of there needs to, they're slightly different goals. But at the end of the day, managing the whole thing together is really, really important to ensure that all these underlying schemes, they actually deliver on their objectives. There's also, and one of the other drivers that we identified sort of when we went on this journey was that there are a lot of investment opportunities that fall between the classic asset class silos. So if you just go into a world where you look at equities, you look at bonds, you start to look at alternatives, and then you build on, that's if you don't look at the whole but just the pieces, then you won't then it's more difficult in our mind to actually achieve your objectives. So that's some of the thoughts that we had around engaging on the TPA journey.
John, I want to pick up on that last point that Mads just made, that whole kind of look through the portfolio at a holistic level, asset classes or strategies that may fall outside of your traditional asset class labels. How has this shift towards TPA really allowed you to see the portfolio differently? What are some of those fundamental shifts that you've noticed as you're kind of looking at the overall allocation?
Yeah, thanks. So I think classic example is probably in real assets, where increasingly, an infrastructure opportunity might have kind of real estate or property elements to it, and vice versa. And by having the teams working together and talking about opportunities and making sure that their sort of pipeline for opportunities is cast wide. Really, as things come in, we can say, well, it doesn't really matter what it is. What are the underlying risk factors that opportunity has, and how can that investment contribute towards the total portfolio? And the two teams can operate in a manner that's really aligned to contributing to building the best overall portfolio. They're not worried about kind of hoarding the opportunities in their area. They're working together to do that. And I think when you operate that way, as Maz says, you're more likely to pick up good investment opportunities. We do notice that when things have some quirks, often they might not be appropriate for other investors, but we can sort of look through the structure that might be around the opportunity, and the characteristics it's got to kind of really get at the opportunity. And often those tend to be some of our more interesting, opportunities when they're sort of multi asset and a little bit kind of complicated. We think there's a premium we can enhance there, and it also helps with sizing. So if you have lots of different siloed investment strategies, each asset class team, each portfolio manager is running those individual mandates with their own objectives, and they've laser vision on their own objectives. And what you tend to find is the overall total portfolio can become over diversified, and sort of you can become over diversified in terms of that sort of idiosyncratic risk that you're trying to get. And yet perversely, sometimes it can get concentrated into these big sort of thematic risks, because all of the opportunities are in a similar sector, or something like that. And obviously, if in my seat and a sort of total portfolio sort of strategy seat, it's those risks that can kind of really permeate the total portfolio. So again, by getting different asset class teams talking, we're more aware of those risks that can creep into the portfolio, and things are sized better as a result.
Yeah. And one of the things that we discovered on this journey on the implementation of TPA is the importance of governance and the soft stuff, the culture, and some of those shifts. I mean, the portfolio is one thing, which we just heard from John, speaking to, but the governance and decision rights and who delegates authority, all of those are both challenges, but also kind of the thing that switches the light on to being a true TPA type of organization. So maybe a question for you, Mads, is, if you're an SAA shop and you've started in that kind of mindset, and now you've identified this might be a better way to operate, you got to have a conversation at some point with your governing body and have an honest look of who owns what, who's making what decisions. So maybe talk through kind of the governance lens of this, and one, maybe the importance of governance in this transition, but two, how do you have that conversation to say, look, I want to take on some of these decision rights maybe more explicitly than before.
Yeah, so I think that it may predominantly be a discussion, or it could start with a discussion about sort of how to better achieve your goals. That would be the starting point in my mind. But then the discussion is with the board is super important. So basically getting governance on this from the top to work. There are many layers in the governance to run a TPA structure. And one of them is to ensure that you have the faith of the trust of your governing body, because part of TPA is that they need to relinquish a little bit of that control they have in the classic SAA world, and actually leave things up to the administration or the executive to do things that they are not used to. So this is about moving from having a very sort of command control world into a more sort of loose or more trust based world. So that's really, really important. So spending time with the governing body about sort of talking about sort of what are we trying to achieve. So the goal, we will achieve a better outcome from this, and then what are the drivers to do that, and why would this work better. I think that's a key set of discussions that needs to happen. And I think it's important to do that at a sort of holistic level first. So the why, and understand the key drivers, the key principles, what is in here. As soon as you start to delve into the details, it gets a lot more complicated. So for a board, it's very good to think about that holistic approach and say, well, they are still in control. But it's just a different way of controlling things, and they will eventually get a better outcome in this. But there are many, many steps in that process that needs to take place.
And John, in our initial conversations around this, I think one of the ways you described where Railpen was as an organization, which resonated with me because of this whole spectrum between SAA
Mhm.
and TPA, is, we're probably kind of this SAA plus TPA or TPA plus SAA. It's not a all or nothing type of value proposition, and that can change over time. As Mads mentioned, you have that conversation with the board, but it's not like a lot of this happens overnight. So maybe talk through kind of how you think about the pulling the best of both worlds if you're kind of in between either phase.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We're somewhere between the two, but we are sort of intentionally there. I wouldn't say we're on a sort of journey the way, like, this is where we think is the sweet spot for our organization, our board, our clients, our stakeholders. And the reason I say that is if you go sort of a full unconstrained total portfolio approach, a classic challenge with that is how do you measure if you're doing a good job? How do you assess that? Because if you purely assess that based on the delivery of, say, a real return over the long run, there's a lot you can't control. And you find yourself in endless discussions around, oh, equity markets are up, oh, equity markets are down. And I would say it doesn't necessarily lend itself to kind of great oversight. So it requires, I'd say, really sophisticated oversight of an unconstrained total portfolio approach, a very sophisticated organization, great data systems. And it's a real challenge, I think, for an organization to get there. I think some around the world have. And we think the sweet spot for us, as globally, let's say, mid-sized kind of asset owner with numerous lay stakeholders that retain that fiduciary duty. In the UK, that's a key feature of UK pensions. We need to be able to explain what we're doing to them, and talking about risk factors and the latest opportunities is very challenging. So we have this sort of strategic staging post in our investment process where we take the time, we do a sort of annual review of the strategy, we walk the board through that strategy, and importantly, we get aligned. So we are looking for them to endorse that. So even though they've delegated to us with quite a flexible multi-asset mandate, we take the time once a year to get aligned, get them comfortable, and that keeps both the governing body that we refer to as the Railpen Investment Oversight Committee, which has some sophisticated non-execs, and the trustee board comfortable with what we're doing. It also gives us something to kind of attribute to, but we try and keep the focus on what we call the implemented portfolio, the actual kind of live portfolio, as much as possible. But again, it just helps us to explain what the strategy is doing, what's our implementation doing, and we find that works. That works really, really well for us. So, I mean, one way that an SAA organization could move to that point would be to, in some ways, run the SAA process more frequently, and run the SAA process where instead of benchmark representations of the asset classes, you're looking at the live portfolio, right? So SAA, sometimes it's a two-step process where you come up with the best mix of benchmarks to achieve your objectives, and then you implement those benchmarks. TPA the focus has to be on the implemented portfolio. So that might be something to look at, replace the benchmarks with the actual portfolio and try and review that more frequently. And I think what you'll find is you'll have a better understanding of what's going on across the portfolio. And you can use those insights to kind of get that alignment with the board, and that might give them comfort that actually we can widen the operating ranges under which the organization can work.
Yeah, and I like that idea of, rather than some artificial quarterly, annually, every couple of years, let's take a look at the SAA and do the reallocation. It's this constant kind of simulation of, okay, in the current state of what we currently have in the portfolio, what's the best opportunity? This whole kind of competition for capital kind of falls into
Yeah.
that mindset of the constant reevaluation. So I like that quite a bit. Um, Mads, I want to pivot a little bit to the next step beyond governance. So if you've kind of developed your relationship with the board, there's a lot of trust there. There's transparency, as John mentioned, where you're walking them through. Now you've got to build a team that can execute on that mandate. So that is something that I think sits at the executive level of how do we think about our talent? What do we look for? What's the culture that we want to create? So how do you in your seat kind of think about the talent equation to all of this in terms of the things that you're looking for, the skill sets, and then importantly, how all of these teams ultimately work together?
Yeah, so from a talent perspective or sort of a people perspective, it's very much about getting people to first of all understand that there's from the client to portfolio journey, that how do you link what you do to what you produce in your day to day, and get that connection. Um, it's important that people speak the same language. So this is about sort of ensuring that this is not English or Danish. This is more in sort of having a vocabulary for what does good look like in terms of a total portfolio. So we get a common understanding of what are the strategic goals, what are the tools that we can lever, and how do we operate. So building that is pretty important. So from a people perspective, it's having people that are open to doing things in a slightly different way and being able to sort of to cope with and deal with that sort of different way of thinking about the portfolio and evolving their way of operating the way they do. So one of the things that we have done in the past has been um, to abolish the word benchmark. It is a very simple thing in your organization. Say we don't use benchmarks anymore, and this is back to what John was just talking about. This is about having a reference return, but you look at you look at the actual portfolio. That's the one that needs to perform. It's not your benchmark. It's not your reference. It's your portfolio that drives the outcomes. And start to having that. And so simple things of doing that is the way that you can approach this. I think that having people that think holistically is important. So back to sort of your talent question. So people that can think about a portfolio in a holistic way are important. So understanding asset classes, sort of across asset classes, and being able to combine them and look at things that are sort of what are the common things and what are the differences between them to ensure that you can get that holistic view. So if it from a people perspective, it's about getting some of those people into your organization and help starting the process.
So, John, I want to pick up on something Mads just said there, is the ability to kind of think across the portfolio. And this is something that we've also explored. And I think you were very helpful in helping us think through this is, the idea of specialists versus generalists, or maybe specialists who have an awareness of the general. As you kind of think about team construction and what you're trying to accomplish, how do you think about the role of a specialist who's got this depth of expertise in a particular area or an asset class with maybe that more generalist mentality, or specific generalists that can then think about the overall portfolio and how it all fits together?
Yeah, it's a tricky one actually. It's one of the more challenging things because the reason you either hire specialists internally or employ specialists with an external manager is because they're really good at picking investment opportunities and managing live portfolios, often in quite a narrow area, say an asset class or even a sub asset class or even particular implementation approach of that asset class. So they've honed these skills, and one assumes that because you're implementing that way, that you're trying to do that in a way that drives active return or value add, because otherwise you would be doing things sort of passively or systematically. So it's important that you kind of let them do that, but let them do that in a way that is as aligned to the best total portfolio outcomes as possible, because often there are sort of good alphas and bad alphas in terms of how to go about generating that active return. And some might be more complementary to the overall portfolio than others. A source of alpha that is sort of constantly going, long equity risk, for example, it might not be very helpful to managing the overall portfolio, but one which is often very diversified is very helpful. So I think incentivizing them in the right way, giving them the right guardrails, because you don't want the overall strategy to be kind of knocked off track because you haven't sort of allocated the right amount of risk to that manager. So I think most specialists, it's about giving them the sandbox, giving them the operating range to go do their job. But I think as the specialist position becomes more and more senior, and it's more about sort of leading the asset class and setting the strategy for that asset class, it's really important that these people transition into a broader role whereby their job is really to make sure that their asset class is best contributing to the total portfolio. And part of their role then becomes having that awareness, having that context. And that can be quite a difficult transition for someone to make in their career. So I think it's important to be quite intentional about that. What we do, as Mad says, we try and give everyone in our part of the organization, lots of exposure to what the client objectives are, what the overall total portfolio looks like, what the high level investment strategy is. So it's just in the back of their mind. So even when they're their job is to focus on their asset class. They're at least aware of the bigger picture, and they're getting exposure to it. And obviously, as someone becomes more senior, they get more and more exposure. They get pulled into some of our cross asset discussion forums. They get pulled into our multi asset kind of investment committees as they become more senior in the organization. But that can be quite a difficult transition for someone to make. And I think the other important thing is um, there's it's important that those tasked with coordinating the overall portfolio, whether you call it multi-asset management or total portfolio management or even just investment strategy, it's important that those people are really credible to the specialists. They've got sufficient depth in each asset class that they can really have a proper peer-to-peer discussion, even if they wouldn't have quite the level of expertise to actually go out and execute. They really understand. So it's important that you get T-shaped people. Yes, they've got that breadth, but there's still enough depth in the different asset classes that they could be kind of really, really credible. um Obviously a lot of people learn investment strategy in quite a sort of theoretical you know context, career path, and that's fine as a sort of learning ground, but at some point you need to really transition into that sort of portfolio management depth of understanding, implementation understanding, um context, because that's really important to kind of credibly coordinate a total portfolio.
Yeah, I want to. So I want to close here with maybe some lessons for those who are listening, watching, and trying to understand this a little bit better. So, John, I'll start with you, and Mads, I'll give you the last word for the conversation. But John, as you look at other funds that do this, and there's a lot of peers that are on different levels of that spectrum, and maybe the ones that are all the way at the end of full blown TPA, embracing this. Um, what are there any kind of common patterns or areas of success that you found that these funds do well that enables them to be successful in a TPA context? And maybe what are some of those things that you've
Mm.
identified?
Well, I would really emphasize this awareness and engagement of client objectives and total portfolio. When I go speak to, I don't know, one of the big kind of Canadian institutional investors, for example, it doesn't matter who you speak to, they know the funding level, they know what the overall total portfolio looks like, they know what the client objectives are. It is just absolutely ingrained in the organization why they are there. And you could be speaking to someone in finance, or it doesn't matter. Everyone's aware of why they're there and what they're there to do, and everyone's really putting in the same direction. And that doesn't just happen randomly. So I think you almost need to think about that sort of communication and engagement piece as part of your investment process. Take the communication very seriously, and do that in a really sort of authentic way and engaging way that people feel excited by, and create that alignment. Because yes, you can incentivize people, you can you know pay them in a certain way to motivate them, but I think you really need to get the hearts and minds of why you're there, and take that very seriously, and put a lot of resource and time into that. So that'd be one thing I'd really emphasize. And there are so many investment organizations that continue to operate in silos, and it's probably because they're kind of under communicating and not getting the right level of engagement on the bigger picture, the bigger purpose.
Mads, for a CIO who is intellectually interested in this, they've read both Kaya papers, they've listened to you guys speak, and they say, this sounds interesting. I'd like to maybe start to pursue this and move down the journey. What advice would you have for them in terms of getting started or identifying whether they're even a good fit in the first place?
So I think first of all, it is to have the dialogue with your board about sort of how to basically what is the goal of doing this, and start at the point of, do we want to achieve better, and this is an identified way to actually achieve better. So that's important. And my advice there is to spend enough time on that. You can't just skip that phase or make that one meeting and then you're done and then you go. That, because this is more encompassing than just small changes. So this is really, really important to do that. The second thing is back to what John was just talking about in terms of communicating and engaging your people. You can't just hire a small TPA team and put them in the corner and then expect it all to happen. You need this to be pervasive in the organization. And this is about engaging people and understanding that so they all have a role in this, and the way they operate is slightly different or might be more different than it was in the past. And then they need to understand that and be part of the journey. The last point perhaps is to think about this as this is not just an organizational change or change of the portfolio. It's also about systems and way you measure. And this is back to the reference and the benchmarking, the remuneration. There are many details there that also need to sort of be to fit into this thinking. So this is again engaging the whole organization about this and ensure that you start to think about all the consequences down the road. This is it's a great thing to do. It works, but it just takes time, and it requires sort of that you have focus on all the details that are in there, and basically when you go on that journey.
Great. Well, Mads, John, really appreciate your engagement with us as we've been through this journey. Like I said, we've been talking about this for a number of years, but that implementation side of it, I think, has been really important. And you've been instrumental for us. And it's been great getting to know both of you personally on top of some of the research we've been doing on this. So thanks for sharing your thoughts today. And of course, as always, thanks for engaging with Kaya more broadly on this topic.
Thanks for having us, Aaron.
Thank you very much.